Thank you. I'd like to add my appreciation to the Cambridge Muslim College for the wonderful conference we're in. Lots of interesting people I'd heard of and have now met, and just thank them for the well-organized, welcoming administration of it all. Marmaduke Pickthall died on the 19th of May, 1936, at the age of 61. His widow, Muriel, asked Mrs. Anne Fremantle to write a biography. Anne Fremantle was born Anne Huth Jackson, the daughter of a wealthy banker and his wife. She, the mother, was a daughter of the sometime Liberal Member of Parliament, junior minister and proconsul, the grandly named Sir Elphinstone Mount Stuart Grant Duff. The Huth Jacksons had a London house and a massive country estate at Pottingworth near Uckfield in Sussex. Mrs. Huth Jackson, the mother of Anne Fremantle, was well connected socially and familiar with the political and literary world of the capital. Anne, born in 1909, was a precocious child. At the end of the First World War, Marmaduke Pickthall and his wife lived at Pond House, a cottage on the Pottingworth estate. The young Anne and Marmaduke, then in his early 40s, got to know each other and became great friends. We have only Anne's account of the friendship, but it seems Pickthall treated her as a young adult and played the role of substitute father. Her own father had been busy and distant and died in 1921, by which time the Pickthall's had moved to India. She was enchanted by his memories of his early travels in Palestine and Syria and the stories and legends he had picked up. She claimed to have become a Muslim as a young girl. When he went to India, it appears he wrote regularly to her with news of life and encounters. She saw him on his periodic visits to Britain. He attended her marriage in London, conducted by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and during the last year of his life, they saw each other after he had returned to England after 10 years in Hyderabad. Anne Fremantle was widely read and had already written a book on George Eliot at the age of 23. She was active politically and stood as Labour candidate against Duff Cooper in a parliamentary election in 1935. She also, in 1961, wrote a history of the Fabian Society. Although Muriel, Pickthall's widow, had asked Anne Fremantle to write the biography, Anne did not have a high regard for Muriel. Quote, "She shared neither his faith nor his talents. He was a gifted and successful novelist and seemed a meowing person, not happy in Sussex or later in India," she wrote uncharitably in her own autobiography. It was as if Anne Fremantle wanted to have exclusive possession of Marmaduke and to be the only woman to understand him. Anne Fremantle destroyed many of the most personal and most interesting of the letters Pickthall wrote to her on the insistence of her husband. She had difficulties in gathering further material. She wrote to a relation of Pickthall that, quote, "Marmaduke is a most elusive person to get facts or material about," unquote. Her book, Loyal Enemy, published in 1938, was long, 441 pages, and it's an intimate personal portrait of a modest, shy man who was able to communicate with a bright child who, in turn, hero-worshipped him. However, it seems to have been hastily written. It sprawls, and although letters and articles are quoted, sometimes at length, there are no references. The book is poorly edited and proofread. Jaffa and Jeddah are mixed up. The transliterations of Arabic are sometimes erroneous, sometimes eccentric. Anne Fremantle mentions that she was given the original manuscript of the meaning of the glorious Quran. Indeed, he translated some of its verses for her when she was a child. Anne Fremantle lived for another 60 years after Loyal Enemy, much of the time in the United States. When in the early 1980s, I was preparing my book on Pickthall, I wrote to her asking about any letters and papers. She replied to me in October 1983, saying she had sent them to Hyderabad, quote, because I thought they may be included in a collection of his works, unquote. She was unable to help about the location of other personal papers of the man she described to me as, quote, my greatest friend from my father's death when I was 12 until his own death, unquote. In 1992, 6 years after the publication of my book on Pickthall, I was in Hyderabad. One of Pickthall's Hyderabad friends had been the historian Farooq Sherwani. When Pickthall finally left Hyderabad in 1935, Farooq went with Pickthall to the railway station to say goodbye, accompanied by his young son Mustafa, who was then about 15. It was Mustafa who was my guide in Hyderabad, and we called on other elderly gentlemen who had known Marmaduke Pickthall. I asked about personal papers. Pickthall had no interest in personal possessions, Mustafa told me. He would have arrived in Hyderabad with one suitcase, he would have left with one suitcase. Pickthall is rightly best remembered as the author of The Meaning of the Glorious Quran. First published by Knopf in New York in 1930, it has gone through many reprints in various countries. In 1938, the government press, Central Press in Hyderabad, brought out an edition with the Arabic text and the English alongside each other. This is how Pickthall wanted his work to appear. In 1970, a Delhi publisher produced a 3-language version with Urdu, Arabic, and English. 10 years later, under the patronage of the ruler of Sharjah, Sheikh Sultan bin Muhammad Al Qasimi, a series of cassettes was made of Pickthall's translation, recited by Gay Eaton, otherwise Hassan Abdul Hakim. The lectures on Islam that Pickthall delivered in Madras, Chennai, in 1925 have also been reprinted periodically in both India and Pakistan. The title is The Cultural Side of Islam, and I think it should well deserve a reprint today. I first became fascinated in the life and work of Marmaduke Pickthall in the late 1970s. I'd lived in Jordan and Lebanon and knew Damascus. When I read his novel Said the Fisherman, I was bowled over by it. I could not put it down. Every page scintillated with insight. I liked the way he used dialogue, translating colloquial Syrian Arabic literally into English. I appreciated the way he seemed to create a distinctive language in which he described the lives of unspectacular Syrians and Palestinians without sentimentality or condescension. His realistic and sympathetic word portraits of ordinary people reminded me of the writings of Sir Walter Scott and Thomas Hardy. I read Edward Said's Orientalism when it was first published in 1978 and was appalled that Pickthall's work was dismissed alongside that of Pierre Loti as, quote, exotic fiction of minor writers. I wondered whether Edward Said had actually read any of Pickthall's Middle Eastern fiction. I looked out for more of his novels and soon came across The Children of the Nile, Oriental Encounters, and The Valley of the Kings. They all had a similar quality of empathetic realism. I then made a determined effort to find the rest of his work, including those novels of his that were located in England. He wrote about 24 novels altogether, about half based in the Middle East and half in England. One bookseller told me that they were unsellable and that some dealers just pulped them as they blocked up valuable shelf space. I did succeed in collecting them all. I'd been lucky in my introduction to Pickthall's novels, for the first 4 I bought and read were also his best. I also got a copy of Anne Fremantle's book Loyal Enemy, and although a vivid and loving personal portrait of the man comes through, I thought that Anne Fremantle had missed Pickthall's literary and political significance. I thought there was something gushing and jejune, sort of simplistic about her approach. He was a man whose work was celebrated by such a varied range of demanding critics as H.G. Wells, D.H. Lawrence, and E.M. Forster, had had a bestseller with Said the Fisherman in 1903, but was overlooked in all the standard works of 20th century literary history. I also thought that Anne Fremantle did not appreciate Pickthall's significance as a 20th century Muslim intellectual. So I decided to write my own book about him. I wrote my book while working as the director of the British Council in Yemen and Tunisia. I advertised for information about his personal papers, wrote to the Osmania University and the Andhra Pradesh State Archives in Hyderabad, but drew a blank. I also wrote to the Karachi, Pakistan newspaper Dawn. I knew many old Hyderabadis had migrated to Karachi after the, quote, police action, unquote, that absorbed the Nizamate of Hyderabad into independent India. I had several answers which I used in my own book. Mrs. Fremantle told me that she did not think Marmaduke's brother Rudolph had any descendants. In this she was wrong. In 1983, I wrote out of the blue to a Pickthall in London, but never had a reply. Their letter was, however, I learned 32 years later, passed on to a granddaughter-in-law of Rudolph, the brother of Marmaduke. She never replied to me, but her daughter, Sarah Pickthall, the great-niece of Marmaduke, who's been mentioned already, showed me the letter in 2015. The letter had been kept. Of the 12 children begotten by Pickthall's father, only 3 had children of their own. So there were 12 children of the father, only 3 grandchildren. Apart from Rudolph's only son, there were 2 granddaughters, both of whom were childless. One was Marjorie Pickthall, whose father migrated to Canada. Marjorie became a well-known Canadian novelist. The other was a historian of Lincolnshire, Mrs. Dorothy Rudkin, who died in 1984. She had kept some family photographs, and by the kindness of her executor, Dr. Robert Pacey, I was able to use 3 of these in my book. The other major source I used, which Anne Fremantle did not to the same degree, was Pickthall's own journalism, especially articles he wrote for Islamic Review, New Age, and Islamic Culture. There were many autobiographical allusions in these articles and many links with his fiction. Sometimes an event in the journalism was transposed into one of his novels. In many ways, my book complemented Loyal Enemy. When I read my own book, it is I think the terse style reflects the kind of extended writing that was part of my own training. It has the flavour of both a PhD thesis and a civil service minute. There's a shunning of ornamental or superfluous prose. My aim was to draw attention to an outstanding but neglected 20th century writer. Pickthall was a man I hugely admired, though I shared none of his intellectual positions. I did, however, appreciate his insight into the Arab Middle East and knew of no other English writer to match him. He lacked the self-centeredness of Burton and Blunt. He was more accessible than Lane. I did not have the resources of university support or academic networks. I was either too busy, too idle, or too impatient to pursue lines that may have led to greater information. If anyone was interested in Pickthall, they would read both Anne Fremantle's book and mine. 3 years after the publication of my book, Marmaduke Pickthall, British Muslim, in 1986, Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses was published. If my book had been published that year, it might have added to an informed discussion about the ethics and responsibilities of the Muslim as novelist or the novelist as Muslim. But my book was already being remaindered in bookshops. Pickthall's sympathies for the Ottoman Empire have been noted in Turkey. A Turkish scholar, Kemal Kahraman, wrote a thesis on him. This was published in 1994. He relies heavily on my book, but also dug out archives from the Public Record Office. Another Turkish scholar, Ayub Togan, is preparing a 30-minute film about his work, about Pickthall's life, which he hopes will be transmitted on television stations around the world. My book was occasionally quoted, and Pickthall's significance was recognised in works such as The Infidel Within, Muslims in Britain since 1800 by Humayun Ansari, and the work of Geoffrey Nash. The former acknowledges him as a Muslim intellectual, the latter as a writer. But in the last 10 years, there has been a steady build-up of interest in the life and work of Marmaduke Pickthall. He's now getting into reference works. Mohammed Shaheen contributed an article for the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, published in 2007. This is now published online. Pickthall has many references on the World Wide Web. He is celebrated in the British Muslim community, and there's a Pickthall Academy in Camden, in London. In 2012, the BBC made a film about Pickthall and two of his contemporaries who had embraced Islam, Lord Headley and Abdullah Quilliam. Marmaduke's great-great-niece, Sarah Pickthall, took part in that film, as I did, and as did Ron Jeeves and Humayun Ansari. Sarah's family had regarded the man with a mixture of pride and reticence, but Sarah is doing what she can to celebrate his name. The BBC film was shown late at night during Ramadan, and there were 700,000 viewers. It was later transmitted on BBC international channels. Friends in Hyderabad, Dubai, and Vancouver told me they had seen it. Then in 2014, two books had extended chapters on Pickthall. Andrew C. Long in Reading Arabia, British Orientalism in the Age of Mass Publication, 1880 to 1939, places Pickthall as a travel writer in the context of his contemporaries. James Gillam in Loyal Enemies, British Converts to Islam, 1850 to 1950, has worked through papers at the Public Record Office and letters Pickthall wrote to Aubrey Herbert to give a good account of Pickthall's First World War activities, of which we heard something from Mohammed Seddon. Claire Chambers of the University of York has written about Muslim writers. In her latest book, Britain Through Muslim Eyes, she discusses perspectives of social Britain as seen in Pickthall's novels. In 2010, the Muslim Academic Trust reissued The Early Hours, one of Pickthall's Turkey novels, first published in 1921, with a 30-page biographical sketch by Abdul Hakim Murad, our host today. 30 years before that, Abdul Hakim had helped me with my book. This novel, The Early Hours, and Abdul Hakim's introduction, has also been translated into Albanian. The distinguished historian of Muslim Britain, M.A. Sharif, has written a study, Brave Hearts, looking at the ideas and contrasting personalities of Pickthall and his contemporary Abdullah Filbi. That was just a few years ago. A Saudi scholar, Ahmed al-Ghamari, wrote a thesis on Pickthall for a United States university and has recently translated my book into Arabic, published in Qatar. The thesis assesses him as a novelist and was registered in a literature faculty. Another Saudi scholar, based at the King Abdulaziz University, Dr. Ibtihaj Sadiq Ali, has prepared a book looking at Pickthall's fiction. She is making the case that Pickthall's works should be seen as part of the standard canon of English literature as much as H.G. Wells or Arnold Bennett or Thomas Hardy. Geoffrey Nash has edited a collection of essays about Pickthall to be published by Brill at the end of this year. The talk I'm giving now is based on a chapter with some changes. I have contributed to that volume. The British publisher Beacon Books has reissued Marmaduke Pickthall, British Muslim, my book, which is available at the back, for a price of £10. Special Cambridge Muslim College price. This talk is based on a chapter I have contributed to that volume. I beg your pardon. The same publisher, Jamil Chisti, is also reprinting some of Pickthall's Middle Eastern novels. I'm hoping Side the Fisherman will be out before Christmas. It makes a very good Christmas present. and one of the other of his novels. He's also going to publish next year an edition of 28 stories, short stories that Pickthall wrote about the Middle East, which in my view are absolutely tremendous. For each of these publications, I shall be writing introductions. The renewed interest in Pickthall has been stimulated by a new 21st century identity politics. The events of the 11th of September 2001 in New York and 7th of July 2005 in London, committed in the name of Islam, have challenged Muslims and all of us. It's been regrettably easy to demonize Islam, to the anger and distress of all Muslims and many Muslim and non-Muslims. Islam is presented in some of the British press as a violent alien creed. But Pickthall was quintessentially English, conservative in behaviour as well as in politics. He was passionate in his commitment, an intellectual leader. The story of Marmaduke Pickthall challenges the negative stereotypes of much popular press comment. Although rooted in Britain, he was a man of global perspective. Moreover, in his writings, he was liberal, seeing Islam as open, tolerant, and progressive, again in contrast to many of the press stereotypes. It is 30 years since my book was first written. I was drawn to Pickthall through his fiction. My predecessor was drawn from a childhood friendship. Both Anne Fremantle and I wrote from the perspective of our generation. There is, I most strongly believe, a pressing need for a new, thorough biography of Marmaduke Pickthall. There are many archives that have been incompletely explored. I was in Hyderabad earlier this year, and thanks to my friend Dr. Jafar Qureshi and to Princess Esra, granddaughter-in-law of the Nizam of Hyderabad, who had known Pickthall and was the patron of his translation of the Quran, I discovered some Pickthall letters and papers relating to his work for the Nizam in arranging the marriage of the Nizam's son to the daughter of the last Ottoman Khalifa, Abdul-Majid. I firmly believe that there may be more relevant papers in Hyderabad. In addition to going through archives and searching for others, the new biographer should examine Pickthall's literary output as a whole in my book. I related his journalism to his fiction, but my recent rereading of his novels have persuaded me that there is a link between the style of his Middle Eastern novels and his translation of the Quran. In his 1923 essay, Salute to the Orient, E.M. Forster wrote in praise of Pickthall's Near Eastern fiction. He was, Forster said, a writer of much merit who has not yet come into his own. A fresh biography that may be written by somebody in this room of this remarkable man would ensure the fulfillment of E.M. Forster's prophecy.